Hi, hello, and welcome to my channel. I did not think that I was going to be filming this video this month. I read like 3 books in the first week and a half of February, and then I literally didn't read anything until the very last few days of February. As a matter of fact, a couple of the books that I'm adding into this video weren't even read in February. I read them in the first few days of March, but all of those books are within the same series, so I figured I'd just talk about them all at once. So we went from basically reading almost nothing in February to reading 7 books. And without further ado, let's talk about it. So the first book that we read in February was The Scarlet Veil, and this book was so freaking good. And I'm gonna be honest, I feel like I've already talked to you guys about this book in some video. I watched my last reading wrap up to make sure that I didn't talk about it then, and I didn't. So I don't know when I would have talked to you guys about this book, but I feel like I have already. But I am absolutely obsessed with this book. The Scarlet Veil is a spin-off series of the Serpent and Dove series, which I just finished reading recently, and I also really loved. That one is essentially a romance between a witch and a witch hunter. This spin-off series kind of follows a side character from the original Serpent and Dove series, and we got vampires in this one. I've read a couple of spicier books involving vampires, but this is the first fantasy, proper fantasy romance series involving a vampire, and I absolutely loved it. Also, too, another really big thing that I loved about this series or this book was that we got to still see the characters from the original series involved in this book as well. Obviously not as heavily, but they were there. And I'm just excited in general that this kind of world is continuing because I do really enjoy it. So highly recommend The Scarlet Veil. I think I rated this 5 stars. If I didn't, I'm giving it 5 stars now because I really loved it. The next 2 books that I read in the first week of February are Powerless by Elsie and then Savage Lover by Sophie Clark. If you're new to my channel, I have been kind of tandem reading these 2 series. Not for any particular reason, I just kind of purchased the first 2 books together, read them together, and then have kind of been making the series last by kind of just purchasing each book one at a time and reading them kind of in pairs, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of why I'm talking about these 2 books together, and these are the 3rd books in their respective kind of series. So again, we have Powerless by Elsie Silver, which is part of the Chestnut Springs series, and this one in particular is a childhood friends to lovers story, which was so freaking adorable. The main character in this one is Jasper, which is essentially, if you're unfamiliar with the Chestnut Springs series, you follow the Eaton family, and Jasper is not biologically part of the Eaton family, but he was kind of pseudo adopted by Harvey, who is the father, and each of the books in the series basically follows the romance story of one of his children. I think there's 3 sons and 1 daughter. But anyway, this particular book again is about Jasper, who as an adult has become a professional hockey player. And then we also have Sloane, who is the Eaton brothers' cousin, and she is a ballerina. Just the concept of that in and of itself is super cute to me because you kind of have the rough and tumble kind of hockey player with this delicate ballerina. Even though Jasper is definitely not described as a rough character, he's kind of been in the other 2 books, but he's just kind of been a silent presence in the other ones. He's very quiet, very reserved to himself. So it was really interesting to finally kind of get his perspective. I wasn't sure if I was gonna love this one when I first got into it because Jasper was such a non-character in the other 2. It was really actually kind of fun to get his perspective. Also too, it was kind of fun to get a little bit of a tone switch in this one because the first book, Flawless, we had Rhett and I cannot remember her name. They were both outgoing, kind of aggressive, not aggressive, just outgoing, boisterous characters. And then in the second book, we had a very grumpy sunshine kind of coupling. And in this one, we have 2 characters that are both kind of more soft-spoken and sweet. And it was just a wholesome, cute, freaking story. Also too, another thing that I've really been loving about this series in general that I keep forgetting to mention is the ends of the book. You get little bonus chapters of Harvey, and those little stories have been so cute. This most recent one I haven't read yet because it's kind of taking a turn, I think, from where the direction of the other 2 are going, which is basically him on a dating website, which is so random. But this one is kind of a little bit different, and I'm definitely gonna read it before I read the next book, but I don't know. I have an idea of where it's gonna go, and I'm very excited for Harvey if it goes in the way that I'm thinking, but I'm just not ready for it yet. And then again, the next book that we have is Savage Lover by Sophie Clark, and again, it is the 3rd book in the Brutal Birthrights series, and unfortunately, This is my least favorite of the series so far. After reading Crossed, which is the most recent book in the Never After series by Emily McIntyre, and then after reading this book, I'm starting to realize I don't like stories that revolve around characters that are supposed to be like characters that are in power and supposed to kind of morally be higher than your average person who are not. So in Crossed, we had a character that had kind of like a priest type position. I'm not a religious person. I don't know the differences between like priest, father, what have you, but he was like a priest type figurehead. And essentially he just ran around like stalking people and murdering them, and it just really irked me. And I felt a little similarly about that to this one, because although the main character, like the love interests, are not corrupt people, aside from the fact that this series is literally about mafia families, like that to me doesn't bother me because they're bad and they say that they are. But this one basically has a corrupt cop element, and it just bothered me, which this one does, by the way, involve Nero Gallo, or Nero Gallo. I don't know how to say his name. Basically, the majority of these books are about the Gallo family or the Griffin family. And what I do really love about these books is you do get kind of like illustrations. So it actually shows like images of the families. And I do actually reference this while I'm reading to kind of like get a picture in my head of what the characters look like. So this book is basically about this guy right here. And the other character that we have is Camilla Rivera, who is not part of a mafia family. She's kind of more of like a normal person that's just kind of like really struggling to get by. And essentially Camilla gets wrapped up with a dirty cop and he's having her do all these crazy things. I just really hated that aspect. The fact that Camilla is like this good person and she's just trying to survive, and she's got this a-hole. He's literally doing the opposite of what he's supposed to be doing and providing for her as a citizen. Don't be someone that's supposed to protect someone and instead send them out in the middle of danger. Like, yeah, so after just reading 2 books with people in power abusing their power, I know that is not a theme that I am ever going to like. It just, in a real life way, irks me. That whole concept just was too distracting to me to really be able to get into the romance. Overall though, I did end up rating this like 3 stars still. It wasn't like a bad book. I just, if that kind of thing doesn't bother you, obviously, I think this is gonna be just as good as the rest of the stories. Just for me personally, it was my least favorite. If I was to reread the series, I probably would skip this one. Now let's go ahead and get into the almost entire series that I completely binged, sprinted through in the last few days of February. The Dark Olympus series. I do only have the 4th and 5th book, I believe, of the series, because the 2nd and 3rd I already returned to the library. But these are all of the books that I've read in the series so far. I read the first book, Neon Gods, at the very, very beginning of last year. That one is basically a Hades and Persephone kind of retelling, or book inspired by. I wouldn't necessarily call these retellings. You have characters called, you know, Persephone, Aphrodite, Apollo, things like that. And all of the characters do live in a city called Olympus, and the city kind of structure, politically, I guess, is in the structure of the 13 gods. So this series is definitely inspired by Greek mythology, but I don't think it's necessarily like retellings. But these have been so fun to read. These are very spicy, smutty books, and each of them does kind of focus on a specific couple or a specific few people. And originally when I talked about the series, I did call them interconnected standalones, but I no longer stand by that. I do not think these are standalones anymore, because although the main focus of each of the books is kind of the romance between the characters, there is kind of an ongoing and growing story that develops throughout the series. Specifically in these last 2 books, I feel like we almost focused more on the outside story versus the romances. So I definitely would not recommend reading these out of order. But that being said, let's kind of go ahead and talk about each of the books individually. So the 2nd book in the series is called Electric Idol, and this one follows Psyche and Euros. I don't know if I'm saying either of those names right, but this one kind of also has a little bit of that kind of grumpy sunshine kind of theming, but like extra dark and spicy, which was honestly a great combo. So we have Psyche, who is one of Demeter's daughters, and she's definitely kind of the more put together one. She's very like strong, independent woman, but really sweet and nice kind of personality. And then we have Euros, who is Aphrodite's son, and essentially her hitman. So he's basically got this really bad reputation. Everyone kind of like keeps their distance from him. So we have the grumpy and we have the sunshine. And this one also does have a little bit of kind of like a, not necessarily Romeo and Juliet, but kind of like a forbidden love type of situation, because Aphrodite and Demeter, the 2 parents of these people, are rivals. They don't get along at all. They've always hated each other. They're always trying to like undermine the other one. And then there's also kind of like a forced proximity type of situation as well, which I've come to really love, specifically in like smutty books. I just feel like that's the best way to kind of build tension, and I really enjoyed this one. The third book in the series is called Wicked Beauty, and this is the one that was my absolute favorite of the series so far. The series as a whole is supposed to be 10 books, and there's currently 7 out, or 6 out, and one of them's going to be released in August of this year. So I still have plenty to read to really know if this one's my favorite, but so far this one is definitely at the very top. So first off, the main reason that this one is one of my favorites is because this one is actually a romance between 3 individuals. And if you've been following my channel for a little bit of time and you've heard me talk about smut in the past, I really particularly love multiple partners when it comes to spice and smut. They kind of just tend to have this almost like sweet, wholesome-y found family vibe intertwined in all the spice that I just really love. But anyway, this one is about Helen of Troy, who Helen is actually, I don't know if this is true within Greek mythology, but in this series, Helen is one of Zeus's daughters. So it's Helen, Zeus's daughter, Achilles, and Patroclus. And this one was also one of my absolute favorites because not only is there the multiple partner thing, but also we have trials, which again, if you've been on my channel for any amount of time, especially recently, you know that it is one of my absolute favorite fantasy tropes. I love a good trial to the death. These ones are not to the death necessarily, but we have trials, and it was so good. Although these books are kind of like inspired by Greek mythology, these are not in any way kind of fantasy novels. I know with like A Touch of Darkness, that is a fantasy book, and I think that's the reason why I didn't love Neon Gods right away and why it took me so long to like get back into the series, because I read A Touch of Darkness, which is a fantasy novel about Hades and Persephone, and then I read Neon Gods, which is another retelling of Hades and Persephone, but they were not magical in any kind of way. It's just normal people that are basically, it kind of has like an overall mafia type of vibe where these families just kind of, you know, have to protect their positions. They rule this city kind of a thing. So there's no magic involved. So essentially in this world, we have the 13 gods. 3 of them are kind of born into their position, Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon. And then as far as like the rest of the 10 of the gods go, each one of them has a specific task or assignment or like voting system that they have to do to become that god. And that's basically the whole concept of Wicked Beauty. Essentially, the book opens up with Ares dying because he's just really old, and they have to re-elect a new Ares. And because he's the god of war, the applicants basically have to complete 3 trials to become the new Ares. And essentially all of our love interests cross paths because they are vying for the chance to become Ares. And it was just so good. Next up we have Radiant Sin, which is the 4th book in the Dark Olympus series. And this one is between Apollo and Cassandra, who I don't believe has anything to do with Greek mythology. I think she's just kind of like a made-up character. The beginning of each book has kind of like a graph showing kind of like the structure of the 13. We kind of have like the core 4, which again is Hades, Poseidon, Zeus, and then Hera, which is Zeus's wife. And then we have the rest of the 13, and then the outer circle is the children of the 13. And Cassandra is basically the daughter of a fallen house, but essentially she does work for Apollo, and she's always kind of had a crush on him, but because she is kind of like a disgraced member of the community, she never really like says anything about it or does anything about it. But then of course they end up in a situation where they kind of have to fake date, and there's also a little teeny tiny bit of like a murder mystery kind of aspect to this one as well, which was really fun and different. So I really like this one as well. And then last but not least for this video and this series so far, we have Cruel Seduction, which is the 5th book in the series. And this one I went into with such high hopes because again, we have another kind of like multiple partner situation involving 4 different people. And this one also involves Aphrodite, which is a character that I've grown to be very interested in. So I was excited to kind of get more of her story. But I don't know. This one kind of like fell flat. Like the romance for me just wasn't it. I really enjoyed the story outside of the romance, but as far as the actual romance itself, this one was definitely my least favorite of the entire series so far. This romance involves Aphrodite and Adonis, and then Pandora and Hephaestus. The structure of this one is essentially we have Aphrodite and Adonis over here, and then Pandora and Hephaestus over here, and each pairing kind of has grown up knowing each other, whether they're romantic or not, and the 2 groupings of people basically get intermeshed together. I think the thing that bothers me about this one is that this one feels probably like more of a realistic representation of a polyamorous relationship, and I just really want my fictional happy-go-lucky, everyone loves each other equally version. And this is just not that. Instead of feeling like one cohesive relationship, it just feels like a bunch of people in relationships, but like together but separate. I don't know. I didn't love it. But that being said, I am still very, very excited to get into the next book, and I would have already read it by now, but someone has it checked out at my library, so hopefully I get it soon. It's actually due in a couple of days, so I'm really hoping the person brings it back on time and I can read it.